Hi everyone, it's me, Megan, and I am going to be discussing panic disorder today. So let's begin with some background information. Panic disorder affects about 2 to 3 million American adults, and like a lot of the anxiety disorders we were talking about, it is more commonly diagnosed in females with a 2 to 1 female to male ratio. Panic disorder usually has a childhood or teenage onset. People have their first panic attacks as a child or teenager, and that later goes on to develop into panic disorder into their 20s and so on. One interesting statistic I found was that 6.8% of adults meet the criteria for panic disorder at some point in their life, and somewhere from 35 to 50% of adults will experience a panic attack in their lifetime. I think this is probably more toward the higher end because you can have plenty of panic attacks but not necessarily be diagnosed with panic disorder, which I will discuss on the next slide. According to the DSM-5 criteria, to be diagnosed with panic disorder, you must have recurrent, unexpected panic attacks. Panic attacks can include the symptoms seen in this image, such as racing heart, nausea, and shaking. A lot of people say that they feel like they're choking when they experience a panic attack. However, it is important to remember you cannot diagnose a single panic attack. It is only panic disorder if the person has persistent concern or worry about future panic attacks and/or avoids situations that may cause a future panic attack. One example of this is traveling or going away from home. Often people panic when they're going to a new place, so those with panic disorder would stay at home all the time because they're afraid of another panic attack happening. When diagnosing panic disorder, it's important to remember that panic attacks cannot be due to other health conditions or substances the person is taking. Physical conditions such as diabetes and heart attacks can look like panic, and often drugs of abuse send people into panic attacks. As with other disorders, you want to make sure the person is being treated for underlying conditions first. A lot of the research I found dealt with different theories of what causes panic disorder. The first set of theories are these biological theories that are concerned with the levels of neurotransmitters in the brain. As mentioned with other anxiety disorders, low levels of serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine could be causing panic disorder. We know these neurotransmitters are at fault because of the treatments that help people with panic disorder. I listed a bunch of the treatments here. So the first one is SSRIs. SSRIs increase serotonin levels, which shows that serotonin may be playing a part in panic disorder. SNRIs act on both serotonin and norepinephrine, so it could be a combination of these neurotransmitters that contribute to panic. Tricyclic antidepressants affect serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. MAOIs, which are those monoamine oxidase inhibitors we talked about before, inhibit the enzymes that break down norepinephrine and serotonin so that there is more serotonin and norepinephrine at the synapse, there's more to bind, you have higher levels. Another biological theory is that panic disorder is due to low levels of GABA in the brain, which we all know is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter that generally helps calm and relax us. One thing we know is that benzodiazepines are very effective in treating panic disorder. Benzodiazepines activate GABA receptors to enhance GABA's ability to inhibit, which subsequently calms us down. I found a study that looked at PET images in people with panic disorder and people who were completely unaffected. The study showed lower levels of GABA in panic patients than non-affected controls. The orange/red color that is here shows GABA receptor binding. So the control has plenty of GABA activity, lots of GABA binding, inhibiting, while the person with panic disorder clearly does not have those colors, clearly does not have the GABA binding that the control does. So clearly, GABA is not doing its job as an inhibitory neurotransmitter for our friend with panic disorder. Next, I found some metabolic theories of panic disorder. So the metabolic theories focus on how the human body processes particular substances and how that could induce panic. It has been found that people with panic disorder are more sensitive to certain substances than people who are unaffected. So some of these substances can actually trigger a panic attack in people with panic disorder. I found there was one study where they injected lactic acid into people with panic disorder, and that actually triggered a panic attack. Lactic acid is a naturally produced chemical which is produced by the body during muscular activities. So a lot of that is not good for people with panic disorder. Other triggers I found were caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, and elevated CO2 levels. I read about a couple studies where breathing air with elevated CO2 levels can actually trigger a panic attack in people with panic disorder, which could be related to the hyperventilating and respiratory problems that often accompany panic disorder, but I'm just hypothesizing there. Next, I looked at the vulnerability and risk factors associated with panic disorder. I found that heritability estimates are at about 43%, which means if you have a parent with panic disorder, you are a lot more likely to be diagnosed than someone who does not have a relative with the disorder. This points toward a genetic component to panic disorder. There are also chromosomal regions, specific genes and alleles that have been found to put a person more at risk. Many of these genes are related to the GABA, serotonin, and norepinephrine systems, which backs up the idea that these neurotransmitters do play a big role in panic. Another risk factor is chronic stress. It is unclear whether stress is a cause or a result of panic disorder, but chronic enduring stressors lead to a worse illness course and poorer treatment responses for people with panic disorder. I also read that chronic physiological stress puts a person more at risk. This would be like people who are living with chronic pain all the time. I'm sure panic disorder is a combination of all of these factors for people, and it's probably some people have some factors, not others, but are still diagnosed with the disorder. I found a ton of information about the brain structures involved. These structures were broken up into the fear processing and the fear regulating structures. The fear processing structures are likely to be overactive in panic disorder. So the amygdala, which we have talked about before, is superactive in response to threatening stimuli in people with panic disorder. If people are exposed to a picture or a word or something that normally triggers a panic attack for them, their amygdala is going to go crazy. MRI studies have shown that there is actually less gray matter in the amygdala of people with panic disorder than healthy individuals. The interesting thing about that is that these effects seem to be greater in the right amygdala. The right hemisphere has been more associated with emotional processing than the left hemisphere, so this could explain why a lot of these effects are right hemisphere specific, which I thought was really interesting. Another fear processing structure is the insula. According to fMRI studies, the insula was also overactive in responses to threat in people who had panic disorder. There were also abnormal gray matter reductions in the right insula. Another brain area is the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, which is abbreviated as the ACC or the DACC. This area is important for emotional regulation and emotional decision making. Damage to the right dorsal ACC has been linked to panic disorder. There was also decreased gray matter volume in the, no surprise, right ACC. So clearly the right hemisphere is an ongoing theme here. As for the fear regulating structures, we have the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. White matter reductions of the frontal limbic gyrus, which is a part of the prefrontal cortex, have been seen in people with panic disorder. That is indicative of a diminished frontal limbic regulation process. I previously mentioned lower GABA levels as one of the theories, and this is actually a big problem in the hippocampus of people with panic disorder. So there's a decrease in the GABA binding in the hippocampus generally for people with panic disorder.